These are live pictures from Kiev, a European capital city where millions of people have spent a third night underground, sheltering from Russian attacks. Overnight, there have been more explosions near Kiev and reports of fighting in the streets in the country's second biggest city, Kharkiv. But for now, the capital is still holding out. Ukrainians remain defiant. Good morning. For decades, we have taken peace and security in Europe for granted. Now we are witnessing a crisis on a scale not seen since World War II. This morning, I'll be talking to the BBC's Clive Murray in Kiev, a city under curfew. Britain says this invasion must end in failure for President Putin. I'll ask Foreign Secretary Liz Truss if he can be stopped. Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy joins me live. He says we need to rally the world. But what more should the world do? We'll ask Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom. To help make sense of the unfolding events in Ukraine and look at how it's being covered across the papers, I'm joined by the former BBC Moscow correspondent Bridget, Kendall, now an academic and author, and by the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson. But first, the news from Ben Thompson.
Sophie, thank you. Good morning. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its fourth day, there are now reports of fighting in the streets of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Local officials say Russian troops broke into the city this morning. Pictures have emerged appearing to show at least 2 Russian Tiger vehicles on fire. Meanwhile, overnight on the outskirts of Kiev, there has been a missile attack on an oil refinery. The massive explosion, 18 miles south of the capital, lit up the night sky and has prompted warnings of toxic chemical fumes. In retaliation for Putin's invasion, the UK, the EU, America and Canada have agreed to exclude certain Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, among other new sanctions. Boris Johnson has said the West is tightening the economic ligature around Russia as the Allies unveil the new measures aimed at damaging its financial system. And hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are attempting to flee the country amid concern in the UK over who will be allowed to settle here. The UN has warned 5 million people could be displaced by Russia's invasion. The Home Office has said its priority was British nationals and their families, but has said it would work with international partners on issues including migration as the situation develops. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Sophie, back to you.
Ben, thank you. Well, let's go straight to Kiev and my colleague Clive Murray, who has spent a third night underground amid fears of an all-out Russian attack on the city. There were great fears for Kiev last night, Clive, weren't there? What was last night like? What's the situation today?
Yeah, it was pretty grim overnight, Sophie. We'd been getting suggestions, warnings that we were probably going to experience the worst bombing campaign so far in this whole war, and it was intense, no question about that. The ridgeline behind me, beyond the Golden Dome of St. Michael's Cathedral there, lit up with missile attacks and fire. And then around about, I think it was about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 huge missile strikes that we think were targeting an airfield just to the south of our position here. And those strikes hit the petroleum tanks at the airfield and blew them up. I mean, it was a conflagration that could be seen from all around. And I can only compare it to the sun rising. It was like dawn, frankly. The night sky lit up for miles and miles and miles. That burned for a good hour or so, and consequently, because of the fear of aerial bombardments, everyone goes underground. The BBC team here, we were in an underground shelter with about 100, 120 other people, and that's the case for the 2.5 million people in Kiev, the 40+ million people across this country. They've now become subterranean, and when they eventually do come out out in daylight hours. The supermarkets are getting empty. There's the fear that the electricity is going to be cut off and fuel is going to be a problem. It is getting really, really desperate and dire here. And frankly, given the fact that the Russian forces have overwhelming force of arms and strength in numbers, there are two scenarios. They try to encircle Kiev, which is what they're trying to do, cut off all access to the capital here, and then they make their demands. Vladimir Putin makes his demands of the authorities and the government as to whether or not the president should step down. That is possibly the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is potentially he decides that, you know what, this has gone on too long and the Russians are getting bogged down in certain parts of the country in their advance. This is going on too long, and he launches direct attacks on the center of the city here. That would be a dire, dire situation. And that is why so many people are simply living life underground, as we had to last night.
Clive, thank you so much for the latest there from Kiev. We're going to talk to you later on in the programme, but for now, thank you. Let's look at the front pages of the papers this morning. Start with the Sunday Times. Terror stalks the streets is their headline. Ukrainian volunteers hunting traitors, the Kremlin and Kremlin spies as paranoia grips Kiev. The Mirror, the fight is here, their headline. The Sunday Express, Lion Hearts, Ukraine's resistance pictured there on the front. The Observer, the world shuns pariah Putin, and a picture of just one of the many, many refugees who have fled their homes. The Mail on Sunday focusing as well on the refugees, the Mail's SOS for the innocent victims of war, and the Sunday Telegraph, fierce resistance slows Putin's advance across Ukraine. Well, with me to discuss the papers this morning, Bridget, Kendall and Fraser Nelson. Thank you both very much for joining us. Fraser, first of all, let's start with you. And it is this image here, isn't it? The civilians being handed arms to fight for their country.
I think the Sunday Telegraph's picture here just shows the incredible scenes that are happening now in Kiev. I mean, the original assumption was that Putin would be able to take Ukraine as quickly as they took Crimea. Minimal force, you'd be able to do it. But the fight they're putting on, a guy here, according to the caption, has never held a gun before, being given one to defend his capital. So now you're finding the Ukrainians repelling the Russians from Kiev. They're now on day 4 of this. And of course, Putin has only used about a third of his 150,000 troops so far. Might he put in a lot more? Might Russia do to Kiev what they did to Grozny? These are the calculation, of course, but the world is now seeing these pictures. The world is seeing pictures of Russian tanks flattening Ukrainian cars. And Putin is losing sympathy in Russia. There's an opinion poll showing 60% are against him. Even China is reporting, the Chinese press is reporting this fairly even-handedly. And China is now asking Putin to negotiate. So it is possible here that what Putin thought were his allies are looking on this thinking, we just simply cannot support you as you go on to flatten what used to be your neighbour. And of course, this isn't some faraway country for the Russians. This is their next door. Ukraine used to be part of their family. So even some of the Russian press are looking in horror at what Russia is doing to what people regard to be their cousins over the border.
Bridget, you spent a lot of time in Moscow. You were there for 6 years. You speak fluent Russian. You've interviewed Vladimir Putin twice. Is it difficult to gauge the actual mood inside Russia now?
It's very hard at the moment. I think, to start with, I, like lots of other Russian analysts, never thought this could happen, for some of the reasons that Fraser said. Ukrainians and Russians are very close, and the reports we're getting from Moscow of people who, one parent is Ukrainian, the other is Russian, they've got cousins in both places. Why would he want to embark on this? It doesn't make sense, let alone the fact that it's an enormous country to try and subdue, and it is in the eye of the world's media. So anything we can glean from Russia is really important at the moment, and it's been very interesting in the last few days to note how the official media is handling this. They're calling it a special operation. Apparently, according to one of the papers today, they've been banned from using the words invasion or attack. It's a special operation. They're trying to make it look as though it's happening in the southeast of Ukraine, where the battle has simmered for all these years since 2014. So they can't really, it makes you realize why Putin might pause before going into Kiev, because how are they going to explain that to the Russian people? And then if you look among certain reports, there have, for example, been frantic mothers who've got boys who are Russian conscripts, wondering what's happened to their boys. there is a law in Russia that says a conscript can't be sent into combat, but if you sign up as a contract soldier, then you can. They're worried they're being forced to sign those contracts. And some of the things we've seen on social media of that tank which came to a shuddering halt because it ran out of fuel, and a Ukrainian cheerfully asked them, "Who are you?" And they didn't even know where they were. It gives you a little sense that below the view we've had in the West of Putin being sort of all-powerful and a chessboard player who can move things around, that there's another reality there that he has to deal with.
Oh, we've got this map here, and that's the Mail, isn't it? And just the size of this attack.
I would say, I think a lot of our focus is inevitably on Kiev, because that's where the journalists are. It's great that lots of papers and BBC and others, broadcasters, have people in other cities. But if I were Putin, I'd be looking now thinking, pause on Kiev, as Clive said, maybe try and encircle it, but go for other areas. So we're hearing this morning about attacks in the south. Surely he's going to want to try and take that sea coast. We know from reports in the Russian media, they announced with triumph that they've taken some land near Crimea so that the water which was cut off from Ukraine, they can now get into Crimea again. They're going to try and get the bit of seacoast which is still Ukrainian between the areas that they control in the southeastern Crimea. And maybe that's what he's going to think about now. And what we're hearing today, reports of fierce fighting in Kharkiv, where there probably aren't so many Western journalists. There are lots of Ukrainians telling us what's happened. I think we have to be very fearful about what may happen in the days ahead, not just in Kiev.
Fraser, the impact and the pictures that we've been seeing really harrowing, and all the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people leaving their homes, trying to cross borders, queues at railway stations, trains they cannot get on.
And it doesn't take much imagination, if you're living in Kiev, to think that Putin might try to flatten the city in a few days, in which case, of course, you would take your family out of there. And we're seeing the UN reckons it's 140,000 people now on the borders, and on the Hungarian border as well. So we're now, of course, this poses a real question to the rest of us. What do we do? Does Britain take them in? I think there's it's a no-brainer for us. We ought to give, I think, asylum to anybody with a Ukrainian passport who wants to come here. Anybody, absolutely. I'm a little bit biased here because my wife's family are refugees from the Soviets. They came from Prague when the Russian tanks came there. And then Sweden at the time took them in. And I think that was a very wise decision for them. But it wasn't so long ago until we gave anybody from the whole of the EU right to come and live in Britain, and things didn't topple over then. So I think that making a big open offer to all the Ukrainians will be the least we can do. I mean, right now we are sending in lethal support. We're one of the first countries to do so. We've sent in 2,000 anti-tank missiles. We've done pretty good compared to other European countries, but obviously it's not enough. And helping the people now on the run, I think, is a pretty clear moral imperative.
And Bridget, this story here, this is the Observer, isn't it?
Yes, here we are, the headline, "Don't call it a war, propaganda filters the truth to Russian media." They're not allowed to say it's a war. So the Russian people, I think a lot of them who are relying on official media are just a bit bewildered at the moment. But at the same time, the other headline on this page is how Moscow's soft power campaign is falling apart. And we're very focused on the hard power at the moment, of course we are. I think the soft power is important too. So the fact there's a report that Western directors on Russian boards are resigning, for example. We've heard about cultural events being pulled. Russia's not going to be in the Eurovision Song Contest. Sporting events. We hear about country after country in Europe who are closing their airspace to Russia. This, I think, will have an impact on the Russian population. Those who are appalled at what their president is doing, and I think there are many more than we know about, will think, well, yes, they should be doing that to put pressure on the Kremlin. But others will be thinking, why are we being isolated? Whose fault is it? And I think it's going to be quite hard. And the thing we have to watch out for is Moscow will try very much to blame Ukraine and say this is all being run by NATO, and actually we're at war with NATO, because they've lost the narrative at the moment, and they're going to try and find a way to bring it back.
Let's talk about Germany and also about SWIFT. Big moves there.
Absolutely. I mean, Germany yesterday delivered 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. Now, that sounds pathetic. It is pathetic in the circumstances. But the Germans had a rule, a law, that they would not send live guns into war zones. They've now changed that, which for the Germans is a huge break from their typical pacifist post-war consensus. So they are going to send now lethal aid to the Ukrainians. And the big question is whether they would back the SWIFT ban. SWIFT is this international banking payment. And Joe Biden in particular has said, look, let's cut Russia off from SWIFT. The Germans have resisted it because they get half of their gas from Russia. They pay for that via SWIFT. If they can't pay for their gas, they think Moscow might turn off the tap. But Britain now thinks it's making headway, and Boris Johnson has been leading the calls for the Russians to be kicked out of SWIFT. And it seems that on Monday, Britain and the EU and Canada are going to announce some Russian banks cut off from SWIFT, not the whole Russian country, because it is rather a difficult equation. I mean, in the Sunday Telegraph, Jeremy Warner points out that Russia's been preparing for this for years. Right now, Britain, almost all of our bank transactions are SWIFT. In Russia, 85% of them have moved to a new system because they've been preparing for this. So cutting SWIFT off might end up causing the outside world more trouble than it causes Putin. And it also might help Putin say to the outside world, look at how cruel the West is, look at how they're impoverishing you further with sanctions. That's the problem with sanctions. They didn't deter him so far. I'm not sure how much impact they're going to make now.
Do you think, Bridget, that President Putin has launched an unwinnable war?
Yes, I do. I mean, the West could tell him that from Iraq and Afghanistan, right? When you try and take a small territory, you can do it. When you take a big one, you can't. You can move in, but how do you occupy it? There will be a Ukrainian insurgency for years if there isn't some sort of resolution to this, which may be the reason why we keep hearing from Moscow talks about, well, maybe there could be talks, because perhaps what he's always thought is he's tightening the screws, but his aim all along has been to try and force Ukraine into talks, because he doesn't actually want to try and hold this country. How can he? Especially think of these Ukrainians, how strongly they feel about their country now, and they've been through this before. Many of them, their grandparents will remember the Second World War.
And Fraser, one final question to you. Do you think people here in the West realise that the impact that this is going to have on people's lives and also on people's wallets? I mean, the cost of this, of the sanctions and the impact it will have here.
I think Boris Johnson has not properly explained that sanctions hit both ways. There was a study a few days ago suggesting electricity bills could be up another £1,000 a year to £3,000 on average because of the price of gas. So if you do sanctions, it really does hurt your own economy. You need to tell people, look, this is going to hurt us as well as them. Are you ready for it? We haven't yet had that frank conversation in Britain.
Fraser Nelson, Bridget Kendall, thank you both so much for joining me. Let's find out what the weather has in store with Susan Powell.
Thank you, Sophie. Good morning. Some extensive sunshine to come across the UK today. This was Taunton just a little earlier. You will also notice some frost there, though, on the grass in front of the daffodils. It has turned somewhat chilly overnight under clear skies. But for today, the sunshine, if anything, more widespread than yesterday, as we see it pushing back into Northern Ireland and Scotland, sending this weak weather front out away from the Western Isles for the afternoon. Quite breezy towards the west later on, gusts up to 40 miles per hour for Western Scotland, but feeling spring-like with temperatures of 10 or 11 degrees. Overnight Sunday and into Monday, a different story. A lot more cloud sweeps across the UK as this weather front arrives. Some rain for many overnight Sunday night. A milder start to Monday under the cloud. Lows of 6 to 8 typically. Perhaps just a patchy frost in eastern England where the skies stay clearer into the small hours. Monday, though, and it's really all about this weather front trying to move its way across the UK. It's got a buckle in it, however, which means it's quite hard to plot its journey from west to east that clearly. Currently, it looks like the wettest weather on Monday will push into southern Scotland, certainly affect northern England, Wales and the southwest. To the east, I think it will stay dry, and behind the weather front, some clearer spells, although strong winds for the northwest of Scotland. That heavier rain, though, will shift eastwards after dark. Back to you, Sophie.
Susan, thank you. Well, the speed of Russia's attack has taken the world by surprise, despite the Russian military build-up and repeated Western intelligence warnings when President Putin ordered his troops to cross the border on Thursday morning. People were shocked. I spoke earlier to the advisor to Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Svetlana Zalishuk, and I began by asking her what the situation was in Ukraine this morning.
From what I can read in media, because this is what we do, we wake up during the night, we wake up every hour just to check what's going on to our city, to our home, to our country. So Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is under control of Ukrainian military forces. The rest of the cities, as our Minister of Defense state, also under control of Ukraine. At the same time, we see that there were a number of breakthrough of military equipment in different cities. There was a very a big explosion in the neighboring town to the capital, and the oil plant has been bombed, exploded. It's a huge fire that you can see dozens of kilometers away, which is also can be a problem from an environmental point of view. In Kiev, I read that a family has been just killed, with a small daughter, like 7 years old kid. From what I understand, the Russian soldiers just wanted to take their car from them. So they killed the whole family, and 2 kids of that family stay in the hospital at the moment. It's devastating.
How much longer do you think Ukraine can hold out?
I think that Ukraine demonstrates incredible resilience and resistance. Ukrainian president performs an incredible leadership, it seems to me, and the same with the army. I don't think that Putin actually thought that. I think he thought that it would take much quicker to conquer Kiev. This is what we hear. This is what we've heard from his speeches. This is what we read also from the intelligence data, that they are really surprised that they can't move forward, that they can't go into the cities and get the control. Probably he thought that his people will be welcomed here, or he will be welcomed here, but instead he received 40 million nation united in its hatred and its resistance against Russian army. It's very difficult to say how much time will it last longer, but I definitely know that we are ready to protect our country. Ukrainian army is ready to protect our country. Ukrainian leadership, government, parliament, everyone is there calling people to take the weapon, to go into the streets, to protect their cities. I read today also in the morning that in one of small towns, people just get united with the police, just, not military people, just simple people. They reached the column of the military weapon, of the military equipment of Russians, and they stood there with the crowd, and they stopped them to entering their town. They just negotiated. They would, with their own bodies, they were protected the entrance to the city. Ukraine will not give up, but we need more sanctions and more weapons.
What will happen to members of the government if Russia does take over?
This is a very difficult question, and psychologically, I don't want even to answer that, because I have to suggest that Ukraine will surrender, and we will lose our free and democratic country. We will lose our homes. Me personally, I in that case, I don't know even if I can come back to my home, because I'm blacklisted in Russia. It's just surreal to think that Ukrainian government will surrender and Russians will appoint some puppet government, as we've heard, or as we've read of what Putin was going to do in Ukraine. It's just simply impossible, because puppet government will not be able to operate, because every single person in this country will not accept it.
Svetlana Salishuk, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Vadim Pristayenko. Thank you very much for joining us. How long do you think Ukraine can keep holding out?
We're holding. It's been just 4 days. I believe they will hold as long as needed. That's what actually President addressed yesterday the nation. We'll hold as long as we're here, because we have friends, we have support, we have our people, all of us fighting.
Can you hold as long as needed, though, given the might, the military might of Russia?
I believe that at the moment, Russians miscalculated. They came with 150,000 troops. It's totally not enough. That's what we're discussing even in this studios before, that they miscalculated. They believe that will be easy target, which is not. The whole nation is against them.
The scenes of people picking up arms, civilians, people who have never had any military experience whatsoever, are extraordinary and harrowing. Can they survive that? Can they hold out there doing that?
Many Ukrainians have military backgrounds. I've been in the army, all of us been in the army different times. We still have conscript service, so people are prepared. People know how to operate simple weapons. We're not talking about complicated machinery, but simple weapons like 18,000 of rifles, Kalashnikov rifles, were handed over yesterday in Kiev. Just anybody who can wear them, they took them. We didn't even register them. We have to fight right now. Then later on, we will register and get rid of them when we win.
Do you have news of President Zelensky this morning?
Yes, we talked, and he's constantly talking to his nation, but as ambassador I also talk to him and understand what we are doing, what we are trying to achieve right now.
What about Ukrainians who are fleeing? Because we have seen images of them, hundreds of thousands of people leaving their homes. Would you like the British government to make it easier for Ukrainians to come here?
Your government already eased some of the complications, visa complications, which we used to have before, but it's mostly for those Ukrainians who are still there, so visas are extended for them. We have our neighbors, our nations around us who opened up their hearts and homes to receive as many Ukrainians as possible. So that's easier for immediate evacuation. We need to get them in the close nations. People just opening their houses, they established in sport facilities, in schools, the people are received and taken care of. We will ask nations who are much further distance-wise to support this effort of the smaller nations financially to help them, with humanitarian foods. We have a website withukraine.org, which is accumulating money even here in London. People are coming to my embassy, bringing all this stuff. I don't even know how to bring it back home. All this stuff which was brought by budgets, not the Ukrainians, but every Britons, just the people coming.
President Zelensky says he is establishing an international legion. Would you ask foreign citizens to go to Ukraine and fight?
It was already done because we have overwhelming number of people coming and just bombarding us, staying in front of embassy and requiring, demanding to allow them. We don't want to break any laws, especially international laws. But most of these people who are coming, they're Ukrainians. They have a right to come home at any moment and fight.
And you have a lot of people who are turning up.
You wouldn't believe it's not just Ukrainians. Everybody from all the nations just asking how we can get in.
Are you worried that President Putin's tactics are going to become even more severe, even more violent?
Obviously we do, because he is not achieving what he wanted. He achieved something which is very notorious. They're just stealing water for Crimea from our major river. They're repairing the canal. So they're coming for even economic gains, as simple as that. But they also have to fight Kiev and second biggest city, Kharkiv, which is 2 million plus, and their situation is not looking very good. They're repeating the textbooks of Bolsheviks who came in 1918. Because they couldn't take Kiev, they took the biggest next city and proclaimed it to be capital of new democracy, at that time, labor and peasants republic. And then they moved to Kiev when they managed to get it. So they're doing it again and again.
The West is now cutting some Russian banks out of this the SWIFT payment system. Has the response from the West been enough, do you think?
We've seen enormous, rollover of these efforts and the sanction efforts. I frankly think that we delayed it a bit, and for many nations it took too long. Look at the Germans. They were blocking our supplies, even from here. They were blocking the supplies in NATO to weapons to Ukraine. Now they offered Ukraine 500 helmets. Now they're coming with everything which is needed, but we're already fighting. It might not be enough or too late.
We have seen what President Putin is capable of, and it has shocked many, many people. What do you think the world can learn from this?
Unexpectedly so, in the midst of this, we are not in the clear water yet, but what I see, and can't escape this observation, that we actually see in the first grassroots war against a huge aggressor, nuclear state. It does not matter anymore in this world. People are coming. We talked to one company, big company, Amazon, to help us with establishing the websites, secure websites, and they came with the idea to ask all the employees of Amazon to help Ukraine. That's something enormous, and this help, this assistance. Or Elon Musk opened up the Starlink over Ukraine, which was not operational, was not planned. So people are coming, the companies, the people just to fight a nuclear dictator. This is something very new and gives us hope.
Vadim Pristayko, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Now, the response from the West and much of the world to the crisis in Ukraine has been largely united, and that has included the political parties here in the UK. The Labour leader Keir Starmer has said the country needs to brace itself for the economic pain he says will be caused by sanctions. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, your response, what you heard from the ambassador to Ukraine. What do you make of his comments?
Well, look, I think it's hugely important that we support the Ukrainian people with more arms to fight, and I'm pleased at the decision that's been made by Germany overnight. We had been calling for Russia to be cut out of the SWIFT financial system for many weeks now, and we're pleased to see that progress also overnight. But there is more that we will need to do to stand with the Ukrainian people, and that includes on sanctions. We want to see the insurance industry sanctioned. The government said it was bringing forward 100 names. Where are those names? And there are still people sanctioned who are on the list in the United States, but not on our list.
What about refugees? Ireland have lifted all restrictions for Ukrainians. Should we be doing the same?
We have to have a generous scheme that is equivalent to the scheme that we offered people after the Balkans crisis. Our country has a generous history. Look at those who were fleeing Idi Amin, the Ugandan Asians, those that were fleeing Cyprus, the Vietnamese boat people. Instead, we have a scheme where we're asking people to jump through hoops. There's bureaucracy, there's red tape. Why would we ask people what their salary levels are when you're fleeing war? That is immoral. It is not in the traditions of this country. The Home Secretary has to do more, and she should be acting quickly.
You did say there on Twitter last night, didn't you? You said that the government's still applying normal visa restrictions to those fleeing Ukraine, which isn't true, is it?
It's absolutely the case that you're being asked, have you got family ties? What are your salary levels? And effectively, there's a separate scheme for those who are already in the country who are Ukrainian and those who are outside.
But except there are concessions, aren't they? They have brought in temporary visa concessions.
Asking someone fleeing war what a salary is, it's not enough to say there are concessions. It's not a concession to ask someone what their salary level is, Sophie. That's unacceptable when you're fleeing conflict with your children in your arms. It would be unacceptable for you, and it certainly would be unacceptable for me if we were in the same situation.
What should the government be doing? What would Labour do? How many people would you let into the country?
We've said there should be a safe sanctuary scheme, a proper process and scheme set up, similar to the ones after the Balkans. The vast majority of those fleeing Ukraine will want to settle in Poland or Hungary, in neighbouring countries. That's the UN estimate. But there are some who will want to make their way to our country, and we should have a generous scheme that's simplified, similar to the one that we set up after the Balkans, or indeed the one that we have for Hong Kong nationals. Why are we asking people effectively to go through the same hoops that we would, or even suggesting that they should apply to be fruit pickers in our country?
There was a tweet last night from the Immigration Minister.
Totally unacceptable.
Let me just ask you about Vladimir Putin, because despite months and months of warnings, despite the build-up that we have seen last year, he still invaded when a lot of people thought he actually wouldn't do it. How far could he go, do you think? Is he capable of launching a nuclear attack on the West?
I think it's important that we listen to Vladimir Putin's language, and his language is alarming. He has threatened effectively Finland and Sweden. He is threatening the Baltic states. It's incredibly important that we continue to increase troops on the eastern flank of NATO, that Russia effectively is now a pariah state. No countries in the UN supporting them was very, very important indeed. That we squeeze his ability to finance war, and I hope that it is that combination of effort that helps him to step back from the brink. But of course, this is the most serious issue facing this country and the global community, frankly, since the Second World War. And it's serious because he does have nuclear weapons. And of course, we could see a standoff effectively with NATO. So we must de-escalate, and we must stop his ability to move forward.
You voted against the UK having a nuclear deterrent in 2016. You must be relieved now that we do have one.
I think that was about an increase in the nuclear deterrent. None of us want to see nuclear weapons used. We should not use the phrase lightly, but of course, Britain must do all it can with its NATO allies to stand up to Vladimir Putin's threats.
Do people in the West, in the UK, have to be prepared to accept the economic pain that is going to be inflicted on us because of the sanctions that we have to inflict on Russia?
Look, I think you're right that grown-up politics is about saying that sanctions isn't just about inflicting pain on the country receiving those sanctions. Of course, it has an effect on our own economy. But I do say, particularly in relation to energy prices, that's why we need a windfall tax on the oil and gas, who've made huge profits. That's why the government should not be countenancing a tax rise in national insurance. And that's why they should be supporting people with their energy bills and not asking them to pay back a loan. For all of those reasons, the issues that we've been raising for months now become more important, not less important.
Do we need to look again at something like fracking to give us a more sustainable energy source?
We should have been diversifying our energy supplies, making sure that we were investing in renewables. We should not have made the decision that the government made around gas storage.
What about fracking, though?
Greater pressure. I'm afraid I'm not briefed sufficiently on fracking to start throwing that around, but I do think we should have diversified our energy sources, renewables, nuclear, the whole package of things that we said we would do, that I'm afraid haven't been done.
David Lammy, thank you very much for joining me. Well, we will come back to events in Ukraine in a moment, but first something very different. A TV series that has gripped millions of people for years now, but is coming to an end. Killing Eve has reached its 4th series. It begins next week. If you can't wait that long, you can start watching it on iPlayer tomorrow. Let's have a look at what you can expect.
I'm hardly asking for a kidney, Eve. But if I am, I'm offering you a slice of lung in return. You're clearly still looking into them. Why else would you be working for a private security firm?
The people are nice.
I'll pay for access. I mean, money's not a problem.
Well, I'm delighted to say that Fiona Shaw is with me in the studio. Can this really be the end, the final series?
It is the end, and maybe it's no bad thing when you hear, the facts of this week are sort of trumping the fiction of Killing Eve. Maybe all things come to an end and at the right time. But we're very sad to see the series go, of course, because it was a way of exploring all the outlandish things that might happen in the world. The awful things, every now and then, the awful things do happen.
And it has taken off, really, hasn't it? From series 1, it really has caught people's imaginations. It's something. It's the story, the gripping story.
Yes.
It's the super spy, isn't it? But it's also the humour, the dark humour that is used with it.
I think what's extraordinary about Killing Eve, and I think Sally Woodward-Gentle, our producer, has said this, that the plot is merely the premise of the thing. People begin to enjoy spending time with those characters. They're as interested in Carolyn buying chops as they are in solving world issues. And I think it's very empowering for the viewer. And I think that's probably what all fiction does, is that it gives people energy. You think, oh yeah, that's really silly. They're really silly underneath. And it gives people power, I think, to watch it. So it's become very popular. People, I don't think, care what we're talking about once we're talking about something.
There's a lot of, you mentioned Sally Woodward-Gentle, the executive producer, and there's a lot of luck, a lot of chance that's been involved in this series, isn't there? Because she discovered it completely by chance. They were just novellas, weren't they? Very, very little known novellas. And she then got Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who wasn't that well known, to write the first script.
I think that was a stroke of genius, that she saw Phoebe's mind and, applied it to something I don't think Phoebe had ever thought of, which are these strange novellas to do with suspense, but they're not even suspense, they're sort of fantasy suspense, aren't they? And Phoebe has a marvellous mind for this kind of thing, which is she's almost like Oscar Wilde, that she can turn anything on its head and somehow make you see the other side of something. And somewhere the gap between seeing the truth of something and the lunacy of something, in the gap is humour, and she's a master of that.
And she loves you, because she not only used you in this, and your role got bigger and bigger in this, didn't it?
It did.
You're also in Fleabag with her as well.
Yes, well, a very small role of Fleabag, but she asked me, as one Christmas, said, will you come in and do this day? And what was astonishing about Phoebe, this is Fleabag, where she played this person trying to go through her life and understand the horrors of being a woman in early life. I played her psychiatrist, but while she was, or her psychotherapist, but as she was speaking and acting the scene, she was also directing it. I mean, she's a real, plate spinner.
You've obviously got your part in Killing Eve got bigger and bigger, didn't it? What was the secret? What was the sort of secret to Carolyn Martin, the character you played?
Well, I didn't intend the part to get bigger and bigger. The wonderful thing about playing Carolyn Martin, I mean, a person so unlike myself, is that she's full of power, swoops down the staircase every now and then and tells everybody where they're wrong or how she knew the answer to every question in the first place. But it got bigger when the writers began to get interested in who she was. I was very happy with her remaining mysterious, but they began to explore her home life and then her past, or who she really is and what would she be like without power, which is very much what this season's about, is that if you take away Karen's power, who is she? And I mean, the truth is that most people are just people like you and me, if you take away the thing that makes them, that empowers them. But that's been what's been explored this season for me.
And what I love about you is that your roles, you know, they get bigger and bigger. When you were, I think I must be right in saying, when you were in your 20s, you thought that was old. In Hollywood, 28 was old.
Yeah, I was going to Hollywood. I was doing My Left Foot, the film, which had been the first sort of major film that came out of Ireland at the time. And then I did a film called Mounts on the Moon, and people said, would you like to go to Hollywood? And somebody said to me, well, I'm afraid you're very old. I was 28. I thought, why was I doing all those Shakespeare heroines for the last 5 years? I could have been in Hollywood. But actually, I was very glad to do what I did. I don't think I really wanted to be in Hollywood and be living by a swimming pool and, you know, listening to the sound of, you know, water coolers. I was very glad to be where I was.
And 28 definitely is not old. We know that.
No.
Well, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for coming in. And
thank you for having me.
The series, we all look forward to seeing it.
Yes.
Series 4, I'm very sad that is it, though.
Well,
Fiona Shaw, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, let's now return to events in Ukraine, where despite fears of an all-out Russian invasion or assault on the capital last night, it did not actually happen. The city is still under curfew until tomorrow morning. Millions of people are sheltering and have been told that anyone on the streets will be assumed to be the enemy. I'm joined now in the studio by the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning.
What is the latest intelligence you have on the situation in Ukraine?
Well, the latest intelligence we have is the Ukrainians are fighting very hard. They are resisting Russian advances. We haven't seen any major changes overnight, but what we are seeing is just huge bravery on the part of the Ukrainians in resisting this huge force from Russia, this unwarranted, prefabricated invasion.
Do we know for sure that President Zelensky is safe?
Well, the Prime Minister spoke to President Zelensky last night. I'm in regular touch with my Foreign Minister counterpart, and of course we want them to stay safe. What is so important, though, is that he is leading the resistance against this Russian invasion. The United Kingdom are doing all we can to support in terms of the supply of defensive weapons, the supply of humanitarian aid, the supply of economic support to Ukraine, because it is vitally important that we stop Putin in Ukraine. What we know is his ambitions go further, and this is why we are, working with our allies on the severe package of sanctions. Last night we brought in the prohibitions on use of SWIFT. We're also, as I say, working with our allies to support the Ukrainian resistance on the ground.
President Zelensky has asked for people from abroad to join an international force. Would you support that?
I do support that. And of course, that is something that people can make their own decisions about. But they are fighting. The people of Ukraine are fighting for freedom and democracy, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe, because that is what President Putin is challenging. And absolutely, if people want to support that struggle, I would support them in doing that.
So you support Britain, people from Britain, going over to Ukraine to help in the fight?
Absolutely, if that's what they want to do. And we are doing all we can to support with defensive weapons. Last night we saw the Germans are contributing defensive weapons now for the first time. The UK led, we were the first European country to supply defensive weapons into Ukraine, but we are now seeing our allies doing that. The Defence Secretary held a donor conference on Friday. We had 25 countries turning up, and we are seeing a huge united effort across the G7, across our allies, to challenge Vladimir Putin, because this is Putin's war. This is prefabricated, preordained aggression to try and subvert a sovereign democracy, and we simply cannot allow him to succeed.
How far do you think President Putin will go? Do you think he is capable of using a chemical, even a nuclear attack?
Well, I fear that this will be a bloody and long-running conflict, but senior Russian officials should be aware that if they do go into that arena, they could well be tried for war crimes in the future. I mean, this would be extremely serious escalation of the situation.
Is President Putin a war criminal?
Well, the International Criminal Court has already said that they're looking at what is happening in Ukraine. And if I was a senior Russian official, or indeed the president, I would be very wary of taking further steps.
Is there a red line in any of this, at which point the West has to intervene?
Well, we are intervening in that we are supplying defensive weapons. We are supporting the Ukrainians in defence of their country. And I think Vladimir Putin is surprised by how hard the Ukrainians are fighting and how much resistance there is, and also how severe the sanctions have been from the international system. These are far more severe than any sanctions in the past, targeting Aeroflot, the use of airspace over vast swathes of Europe, targeting the banking system. And what the aim is to do is to degrade the Russian economy, to stop the money that Vladimir Putin has been able to use to fund his war machine. And that will take time. Those sanctions will take time, but it will have the effect of reducing Putin's room for manoeuvre.
The impact of all this, we are seeing pictures of people, hundreds of thousands of people who are now leaving their homes. Some of them there are the stations being put on board trains, one train going out a day. I mean, it is desperate, isn't it? Will you waive visa requirements for Ukrainians coming to the UK?
It is a desperate situation. We're working with the United Nations, we're working with the Red Cross to keep humanitarian corridors open. We put support into the neighbouring countries like Slovakia and Poland to help with the refugee crisis. And of course, Britain has always welcomed refugees fleeing from war, and we're urgently looking at what more we can do to facilitate that. But ultimately, what we need to make sure is that we protect Ukraine as a sovereign democracy. Ultimately, the people of Ukraine want to live in Ukraine, and that is why they are fighting for their future.
But in
there.
the short term, the situation for people there is desperate, as we know. And just in terms of people who are leaving their homes, who are crossing the borders, and there are huge queues to get out. In terms of people who might want to come here, it's still very, very difficult, isn't it? There are temporary concessions in place for some family members of British nationals, but if you're a resident here, that doesn't apply. It's very difficult. Anyone who has no connection to the UK cannot get in. Are you going to look at changing that?
We are looking urgently at what we can do. We're working with European partners about how we support refugees who are leaving Ukraine. So yes is the answer.
So you are looking at loosening
we are
those
looking
restrictions?
at what we can do to make sure we are able to support refugees fleeing this appalling war, Putin's war.
The Immigration Minister, as I'm sure you're aware, Kevin Foster, tweeted last night, as you will be well aware, there are a number of routes, not least our seasonal worker scheme, you will recall from your shadow DEFRA days, which Ukrainians can qualify for alongside the family route for those with relatives here. I mean, the message to Ukrainians is that they can come here if they're willing to pick fruit.
I believe that tweet has been deleted. We are working on what more we can do to support refugees coming out of Ukraine, working with our European allies. But the number one thing we need to do is support the resistance effort in Ukraine. We need to stop Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. There are dire consequences if we don't for freedom and democracy across Europe. That is why I'm so pleased that the Germans are now sending defensive weapons into Ukraine. That's why it's so important that we're doing all we can to degrade the Russian economy by targeting oligarchs, by targeting banks, by targeting oil and gas. We will continue. I've got another meeting with my G7 counterparts today. We will continue to tighten the ratchet on Vladimir Putin, to tighten the ratchet on the economy. We will continue to support the Ukrainians in all that they do.
But for people who are desperate to get out, and we know there are an awful lot of people who are desperate to get out, how soon are we going to start taking refugees? How many are we going to accept?
Well, as I've said, this is something we are urgently looking at. We are already providing support on the ground. We've sent forward teams into Poland and Slovakia. We're helping the Poles, the Slovakians, other neighbouring countries with that effort. I will be travelling to the region this week, and we will do all we can to support Ukrainians both in Ukraine and those who have had to flee because of this appalling war.
It is shocking to see these scenes unfolding in Ukraine, something despite the build-up, despite the warnings, so many people never thought would happen. Let me just play you a clip from the Prime Minister speaking in the Commons. This was back in November.
The old concepts of fighting big tank battles on the European landmass, which I think is what you're driving at, are over, and there are other better things that we should be investing in the FCAS, in the Future Combat Air System, in cyber. This is how warfare of the future is going to be fought.
The concept of fighting big tank battles on European landmass is over, and yet we are looking at just that. Are we going to have to rethink defence, foreign policies that we now know were wrong?
I don't think any of us thought we would be here, and it is an appalling situation to see this war taking place on European soil, this completely unprovoked war, an attack on a sovereign democracy. And we are supplying technology like anti-tank weapons, which are being effective in Ukraine, the so-called NLAWs. We are supplying conventional weaponry, we are supplying equipment, but we are also supporting in the information war. And this is what Russia has been doing for a number of years. After the Cold War, they didn't get rid of their information units. They've been spreading disinformation and deceit, trying to create false flags, trying to create puppet regimes. And we have re-established our information cell. We have been active in supporting the Ukrainians. So this is a hybrid war. It's not just a war about conventional weaponry, although I completely agree it's appalling to see the tanks rolling into Ukraine. It is also a war that's being fought in the information space. It's being fought in the court of international public opinion. And I think it was very significant at the UN Security Council, not a single country voted with Russia. They have become an international pariah. They're being cut out of the international system. So we need to be fighting on all fronts. But certainly, I agree with your point about conventional weaponry. We cannot ignore that as well.
Because you look at our army, and it's not just the United Kingdom, obviously it's Western countries across the board, but you look at what is happening here. Our army is now being reduced to its smallest size since 1714. We're cutting the number of tanks we have. We're reducing the number of planes. Defence spending is falling by 0.4% over this Parliament. Are we now living in a world where we actually do now need to rethink and spend more money on a bigger army?
We have increased our contributions to NATO. And in fact, what we need to see is we need to see others step up. And I think we're seeing a recognition of that across Europe. It's very significant that Germany has changed its position on supplying weaponry into Ukraine. I think everybody realises how serious this fight for freedom and democracy is. And we will need to do more. We will need to spend more. And we will need to provide more support. We're already bolstering the eastern flank, so we've doubled our troop numbers into Estonia. We're providing more naval support. We're supplying more air support. But the reality is that there has been, I'm afraid to say, complacency on the part of the West over the past 20 years on the threat that Russia poses, and in particular on the threat that Vladimir Putin poses. That is why you've seen such a strong change in position. That's why you've seen such huge Western unity, which I don't think Vladimir Putin expected. And that is why the sanctions that we announced last night are not the end of it. There will be more sanctions, there will be tougher sanctions. We will keep tightening the ratchet on this regime.
But how effective and how quickly are these sanctions going to take hold? I mean, the government sanctions against Russian oligarchs are being held up by London law firms. You said that in an briefing to MPs.
What I've said is that we have a hit list of oligarchs that we are targeting, but we need to make sure that the legal case is right. So we are doing them one by one. And every few weeks we will release more oligarchs from our hit list. We will sanction them and we will hit them. We've already targeted in the last week over 100 companies and individuals. We're also freezing bank assets, which is incredibly important.
Are these being held up by London law firms? Well, are they making it more difficult?
In any case, when you sanction an individual, you need to make sure there's a correct legal case in place. We have tripled the number of people working in our sanctions unit in the Foreign Office. We are working through all the cases. We need to make sure they're legally watertight. Next week, we'll be introducing legislation on the economic crime bill. We'll be introducing legislation to freeze bank assets. We are taking apart every bit of the Russian system, whether it's the funding, whether it's the support for oil and gas, whether it's the technology, that Vladimir Putin is using for his appalling war machine. We're targeting all of that, and we are doing it as fast as we can.
The problem is that this is all, for a lot of people, too late, and these sanctions will take a long time to kick in. And the real problem is we've been warned about this. You've been warned about this for a very long time. You've known that President Putin is a threat, and this is the first time that you have seriously tried to do anything about it.
Well, that is not true. In December last year, we said, and this is the G7.
Recent. I'm talking over years.
Well, what I'm saying is since we saw the build-up on the Ukrainian border, and we have been warning about this for months, the G7 was very clear there would be severe costs in the event of an invasion. The minute that invasion has taken place, those severe costs have been put in place. These are unprecedented sanctions. And what's very important is the G7 is united. For the first time ever, Japan has put sanctions on Russia. For the first time ever, we are cutting off access to the SWIFT system. We will be doing more. We will be working to reduce dependency on oil and gas. And you know, the G7 represents more than 50% of the global economy. We're using the full economic might of the G7 to target the Russian regime. And you're right, Sophie, not enough was done before. Not enough was done before. And that is why we are redoubling our efforts. We will not rest until we have stopped Putin. That is the very clear aim. Putin must fail. That is what we, the United Kingdom, say, and that is what our allies across the G7 are saying.
Just be honest as well with people here. You need to be honest. The impact it will have, it is going to hit people hard here economically, isn't it? It's the cost of living is going to rise even more.
That is correct. That is correct. But the pain that we will face in the United Kingdom is nothing like the pain that people in Ukraine are currently facing. They are having to take up arms in the face of an appalling dictator using untold weapons on their country. And that is what we have to remember. And we aren't just fighting for the people of Ukraine and the sovereignty of Ukraine. We're fighting for freedom and democracy. And that has a very high cost for us. So it is right that we are prepared to take an economic hit, because the alternative of allowing Putin to succeed will be far worse for peace and democracy across Europe.
Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, thank you very much. And let's go back now for a last word to the BBC's Clive Murray, who is in the capital, Kiev, now. Clive.
Yeah, Sophie, in the last few minutes we've been hearing loud explosions about 6-7 kilometres behind me there to the north. And I suspect the way that this conflict has played out over the last 2-3 days or so is worrying the Kremlin. They firmly believe that this war would be heading towards a conclusion, some kind of resolution now. They firmly believed that this would be more like the war in Crimea in 2014 rather than Chechnya or Afghanistan, but they're getting bogged down. And one simple fact and one simple reason for that is the resolve of the Ukrainian people. They are fighting. 180,000 weapons have been handed out to ordinary citizens. Families are being taught how to make petrol bombs to try to slow the Russian advance. But it has to be made clear that Vladimir Putin has only used about 60% of the 190,000 troops that he has ringing Ukraine, to the north, to the east and to the south. This is going to get much more nasty. It's going to get bloodier. It's going to be hand to hand and street to street. And this conflict has a long way to go, frankly, in a way that the Kremlin didn't think would take place.
And Clive, it is unimaginable for even just the millions of people who are behind you in that city now, nearly 3 million people, who are living underground, who are under curfew until tomorrow at the earliest, and who frankly have no idea what the next few hours, let alone days, hold.
I mean, we arrived here about 4 or 5 days ago, Sophie, and the following day, the bombardment began. And you saw streams of vehicles, cars, vans, whatever people could get in to try to get out of the city. And that was happening all across Ukraine. It is now much more difficult to get to the border areas now, to head west to Poland and so on and so forth. It's much more difficult, and another huge explosion there that we've been hearing, and we're beginning to feel the vibrations here in the center of the city. The war is getting closer and closer to the center of Kiev, and it's going to be nasty.
Clive Murray, for you, for all your teams, for the people there, please stay safe and thank you. And that is it from us. Goodbye.